Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Another video for you. It is about midnight. It is, in fact, exactly midnight as I'm recording this. So I'm a little bit tired, but I had a couple of news stories that I wanted to cover here. And I hope you'll forgive me, but under normal circumstances, I write all my notes down on one of these handy notepads and I refer to that and put all of the information in front of me and try to be as thorough as possible. And but it's been a long day. I haven't had a chance to write down any notes, so I hope you'll forgive me as I try to read off of my phone while talking. But that is not my normal practice, but that's what we're going to do today. All right, a couple of stories that I want to cover here, just a few minutes, I think. The first is coming out of South Africa. You know, South Africa is a very interesting country as it relates to the global situation vis-a-vis Russia's invasion of Ukraine, etc. I mean, of course, I probably don't have to explain that South Africa is a member of the so-called BRICS. It is the S in BRICS, in fact. South Africa is, of course, a key player on the African continent, a very developed developed economy relative to its peers on the continent, or most of its peers on the continent. It is in many ways a basket case. At the same time, you have tremendous social strife inside of Africa, inside of South Africa, both in terms of issues of migration and migrants coming from other parts of Africa, but also in terms of water resources, in terms of the shack dwellers movement, the sort of attacks by the government on working class people, poor people. Of course, I probably don't need to go all the way back to Maracana to explain the Maracana massacre of years ago now, but to explain the fact that the situation in South Africa, despite the ANC, the African National Congress, and the South African Communist Party, and the various ostensibly left wing elements that govern or at least have a share of state power, it is very much a sort of neoliberal, in many ways a kind of a neoliberal style economy, one that is headed, of course, by President Cyril Ramaphosa, who I should note was quite instrumental in that Maracana massacre. Ramaphosa is probably one of the wealthiest people in, well, certainly in South Africa. I don't know if he's one of the wealthiest in all of Africa, but I would guess he probably is. Now, anyway, just that's a little bit of background. I don't have any, I don't have any time to do a full analysis of South Africa, but I wanted to talk about South Africa a little bit because of this story. Headline from the Financial Times: South Africa US dispute escalates as Vladimir Putin calls Cyril Ramaphosa. Okay, so I was actually going to talk about this earlier today, and now the story's been updated with new developments, so it's a good thing that I waited. So basically, here's the gist of the story, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to unpack it. The gist of the story is that late last week, or actually late this week, I think it was on Thursday of this week, the United States representative, the United States ambassador to South Africa, kind of broke with some diplomatic protocol, I suppose you could say, by openly accusing the South African government of evading sanctions and specifically of loading weapons onto a Russian ship that was docked in South Africa and then destined to take the weaponry back to Russia. Of course, in light of the international sanctions regime, this is a big deal. Now, just to get into the specifics, the ship is called the Lady R. Okay, and U.S. Ambassador Brigady on Thursday had accused South Africa of placing arms on the Lady R in December of 2022. This is very, very interesting because the United States doesn't typically like to be quite so aggressive diplomatically when it comes to countries that are nominally its allies. It's not every day that an ambassador makes such a clearly provocative and headline grabbing statement accusing the government of the country in which the ambassador is representing his country, accusing that government of evading sanctions and essentially of betraying what amounts to one of its close economic partners, and that is the United States. So this is a political crisis immediately in South Africa. You instantly saw a flurry of comments from representatives of the ANC, representatives of Ramaphosa's government, but they were sending a lot of mixed messages. On the one hand, you had Ramaphosa and others who had described the statement as reckless. But at the same time, you also had Ramaphosa then sending, let's see, who was it? He sent one of who was it? Of course, I don't have it right now, obviously. Ramaphosa recently sent Sidney Mufamadi, his national security advisor, to the United States to explain South Africa's position on the war. But again, I mean, the real issue here has to do with economics. And I'm going to get to the politics of this in a second. But the real economic question that's relevant here, and for those of us who are Marxists, we're always going to look at these type of questions. The South African government cannot survive, and the South African currency cannot survive if there is an implosion of its trade relationship with the United States. It is one of the primary trade partners for South Africa, and in fact, South Africa has preferential access to the U.S. market through what's called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which allows specified African nations like South Africa, to export goods to the United States duty free. This is very, very important. This is billions of dollars. This is a huge aspect of South Africa's international economic orientation. So, what exactly is South Africa going to do if it loses access to the United States market? So, South Africa's foreign ministry summoned U.S. Ambassador Brigady, and he basically said that he had crossed the line and he had apologized. Did he apologize? I mean, I'm sure he apologized, but did he really speak out of turn, or was this a deliberate ploy by the United States to create a political crisis for Ramaphosa, knowing that this could potentially not only have political knock on effects, but have economic knock on effects? And of course, it did. Instantly, you saw the Rand, the South African currency, fall to a record low against the US dollar on Friday after this dispute really came into light. Now, there's a lot of factors that really need to be discussed, but unfortunately, don't have the time to do that. And quite frankly, I have at least two other stories that I want to talk about here. So I'm going to leave that aside and just focus for the last couple minutes on the politics of this and what we should take out of this. And the first part of this is that Vladimir Putin has now called Ramaphosa, and he has basically said, let's see, that the United States, or rather, that Russia and South Africa, quote, expressed their intention to further intensify mutually beneficial relations. Okay, the idea here, at least some would like to say, that Russia is kind of outplaying the United States here, capitalizing on a blunder by the United States. But I have to admit, I don't see it that way at all, quite frankly. In fact, if anything, I see it going in exactly the other direction. A situation like this shows the limitations of Russia's ability to really influence in Africa and elsewhere. Russia does not offer the kind of economic incentives that the United States does, not for South Africa, not for India, not for any other country that is trying to do business with the Russians while simultaneously maintaining close relations with the United States economically. Talked a lot about India in last year when it became clear that India was importing discounted Russian energy, and talked about the fact that to the extent that that is beneficial to a very small layer of middlemen, bourgeois sort of entrepreneurs in India, it is severely damaging India's reputation and relationship with the United States, which is at least 50 times greater than anything that they have with the Russians. I think it's actually 100 times greater in terms of the total trade volume. Back to South Africa, similar situation, right? South Africa sees in the United States a primary trading partner, a key market. It sees in Russia a nominal friend, a long-standing ally, I guess you could say, going back to the days of the Soviet Union, of course. But more to the point, it sees in Russia an attempt to kind of create a little bit of space for South Africa to operate independently. And well, that's good, isn't it? That's, of course, good. Well, it's not so good when it's South Africa loading fucking weapons onto Russian ships and sending them back to Russia so that they can then use them to kill people in Ukraine and elsewhere. Okay, so that's a kind of a problem here. And there are forces in South Africa that are undoubtedly waiting to capitalize on this, least of which being the Democratic Alliance, the DA, this sort of neoliberal centrist I guess, center right party that has had some governance in certain regions in the country, cities, and so forth, and is vying to potentially replace at some point replace the government that's in place now. And what could be better for the center right, very white political party than to have this dispute and to show that the African National Congress and the ruling party and the government, that they have blundered their way out of one of the key trade deals that keeps the South African economy afloat. And by the way, the currency is in collapse. That's a major crisis. And surely, whatever they got in terms of remuneration for the weapons that they sent is easily outweighed by the negatives here. Does this mean that the United States is some, benevolent country that we should be supporting in terms of its trade policies and its bullying of other countries? Of course not. But we have to be real about what South Africa is doing here. South Africa is trying to play both sides, and it seems like they're failing pretty badly. Now, the other aspect of this that I think is really important is that we have to remind ourselves that there's a whole section of the left that continues to peddle this absolutely asinine idea that that Russia is supported throughout the global south, that the global south is essentially united behind what Russia's doing, or at the very least is united in its such hatred for the West, for the United States and the former colonial powers, that they're willing to side with Russia. This is not true. It is simply not true. If you look at it, you see country like South Africa playing both sides or trying to play both sides, and I would say doing it rather badly. You see the similar situation, as I mentioned, in India. You see a similar situation in many other countries of the global south. The idea that Russia is winning in a propaganda war, there's some truth to that. Russia's been successful in capitalizing on antipathy towards the United States, the British, the French, all of the colonial powers of Europe. No doubt about it, the Russians are able to capitalize on that. At the same time, the Russians offer so little in terms of economic improvement that most countries find themselves trying to sit it out as much as possible. So that alone really undermines the idea that Russia's cobbling together some multipolar world with a wide international coalition. It's nonsense. It's a handful of reactionary, dictatorial states that are supporting Russia, and then a very large number of, well, I shouldn't say a very large number, but a significant number, I think like maybe 25, 26, 30 major countries on the, not even major, 30 countries on Earth that are either abstaining at the UN or trying to play both sides or refusing to condemn Putin, but also saying that they don't support this war, etc. This is the political situation. Putin blundered into Ukraine. And now the question is, are other governments going to blunder their way riding his coattails? Speaking of governments that are blundering and potentially teetering on the brink of collapse, we should, I shouldn't say collapse, but on the brink of disaster, we should talk a little bit about the Turkish elections that are coming in just a few days. Now, I'm only going to spend about a minute talking about this, but the bottom line is the opposition, the anti-Erdogan opposition, is in quite a good position to potentially win this election. Now, I'm skeptical that they will, given the dirty tricks of Erdogan and the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, that he's, the godfather of. There's quite a lot of dirty tricks that are being used so far, and one very, very interesting story that I came across had to do with an accusation from the head of the opposition, who's running, who's Erdogan's opponent, who's outright accused the Russians of meddling in the election using disinformation and even deep fakes, potentially artificial intelligence created deep fakes, or other things like that, in order to try to boost Erdogan. Now, it is very interesting because we have to keep in mind that while Erdogan and Turkey remain member of NATO, and also having its own rivalries with the Russians, rivalries over the Black Sea, rivalries in Sudan and elsewhere, where both Libya, where both Turkey and Russia are active. Despite all of that, Turkey remains, if not not an ally of the Russians, that would be extreme, but friendly enough, and sharing a similar worldview in the sense that they see themselves as regional imperial powers. They see themselves as, great dictatorial leaders and so forth, strongmen leaders, etc. There's a lot of affinity between Putin and Erdogan, despite the fact that on a political level, they're clearly, frenemies. So, what is what is going to happen? I don't know that we can necessarily say. If you read some of the not just opinion polls, but some of the quotes that I've come across, including from experts who live in Turkey and throughout the region, they're basically expressing, I would say, a fair degree of nervousness and worry that this is going to end in a disputed election, potentially in violence. And I think we all know that Erdogan does not shy away from using violence in order to achieve his political ends. Let us not forget, Turkey is occupying Syria. Both in terms of the Kurdish region, but also Turkey's backing of the rebels in Idlib going back several years. Turkey is now trying to normalize with Assad, or at least at a very slow pace. And in fact, I guess I should mention, the Syria and Assad factor is one of the critical um, election issues, along with the scandals around the extremely embarrassing response by the Turkish authorities to that disastrous earthquake a number of months ago. So there's a lot of issues at play in this election, and from in terms of the international orientation that I think is relevant to discuss here, the opposition is clearly tilted more towards reconciling with the United States, reconciling with the West, and trying to abandon this sort of neo-Ottoman, pro-Russian, pro-Chinese orientation that Erdogan has established. Now, I guess I should back away from that statement, because it's not pro-Russian. Erdogan is not pro-Russian. He sometimes finds himself in conflict with Putin. He sometimes finds himself on the same page with Putin. And that is certainly what we're beginning to see in Syria, where the Russians have basically withdrawn almost entirely. Turkey has now inherited the mantle there. We saw it also in Libya. In that case, Erdogan and Putin were on opposite sides, where Putin was supporting the former CIA proxy Haftar and the so-called Libyan National Army, while Turkey was supporting the internationally recognized government in Tripoli. Now, that's all ancient history at this point, because, as always in Libya, things have changed and changed and changed again for the worse. But we don't have time to talk about Libya in this video. This Sunday is going to be a critical day with regard to this election. We're going to watch it on an hour by hour basis to see what happens. Is Erdogan going to cling to power? I think he will. What is it going to take for him to be able to either outright win the election, which I think is, I don't know, maybe he can, maybe he can't, or what is he and his people going to do to rig the election? I think we all understand that that exists all over the world. Countries from so-called beacons of democracy, I shouldn't imply that I'm supporting Trump's version of rigged elections. I mean more in terms of the way that our party system is set up, the way that donors work, the way that big money operates, etc. It's an entirely corrupt political system. And similarly, in other countries, you have extreme forms of corruption as well. I'm digressing a little bit, so let me just bring it back to the key point here. What happens in this election is going to impact many things regionally and internationally. Erdogan has built himself up as one of the maybe three or four most important leaders in the world in terms of Turkey's influence, Turkey's growing influence all the way from Turkey proper into all the way across Central Asia and into Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. All of those peoples, or most of those peoples, with the exception of, like the Tajiks, for example, most of those peoples are Turkic speaking peoples. That is the vision of neo Ottomanism. And that, in a very real way, could potentially be up for a vote on Sunday. So, all right, let me quickly move on here. Let's see. What am I? Of course, working with this phone is just like the worst way to do this, obviously. Let's see. Well, I guess I should quote the Erdogan's rival Kemal. Oh, jeez. Forgive me, my Turkish friends. Kemal Kilicdaroglu. Kilicdaroglu. Oh my God, horrible. I apologize. Quote. This is his quote. Dear Russian friends, you are behind the montages, conspiracies, deepfake content, and recordings that were exposed yesterday in this country. If you want to continue our friendship after May 15th, keep your hands off the Turkish state. We will stand for cooperation and friendship. Very strong statement. Now, could that actually be backed up if he were to win the election? I don't know. But reorienting Turkey back towards the West and away from Russia, away from its own sort of regional hegemonic ambitions, that would represent a seismic shift. And I think it's very important to pay attention to. Um, Okay, let me quickly talk about this UN report that finally has come out. And the UN report that I'm referring to has to do with the massacre that occurred in Mali in March of 2022 in the village of Mura. Now, I've reported on this before. I've talked about this before, but I think it bears a little bit of repeating. Mali, as I think you all probably know, Mali is governed currently by a military junta. That military junta is uh, closely aligned with Wagner, with the Wagner mercenary group, and with the Russians more broadly, the Russian government, etc. They took the extraordinary step of ejecting the French, who had been an occupying military force in Mali since 2011 under the auspices of Operation Barkhane and the anti-terror in the Sahel initiatives. The French were kicked out by the junta, only to be replaced, of course, by the Russians, now by Wagner specifically. Now, there's a couple of stories, actually, I should mention. One of which, and this is gonna, I'll get to the UN report, but one of which had to do with an accusation that was made by the former president of Ghana, who said that Wagner mercenaries were operating in Mali near the border, and that they were and in Burkina Faso, and that they are being paid by being given exclusive rights to very productive mining operations. Now, we know, of course, that Wagner mercenaries have been stealing gold, diamonds, rare earth minerals, all sorts of other very valuable materials out of Africa. It's one of their primary objectives, in fact. And much of those resources are being used directly to fund the war on Ukraine. So all of these things are connected, and we have to keep an eye on how they're all interrelated. So anyway, back to the UN report. Um, so it took, God, what, 14 months for them to issue this report. And this is, for background, in March of 2022, Wagner's forces, along with Malian military forces, carried out uh, just an unspeakable atrocity, the mass execution of 500 people, give or take, in the village of Mura. Now, this is, I'll tell a little story about a Malian shithead that I used to know and talk to who tried to defend this violence. But anyway, um, this is an example of what Russian quote unquote anti terrorism looks like. Anti terrorism in the form of the most vicious massacres of men, women, children in a village like Mura. Close your eyes for a second. Close your eyes for a second and try to picture what slaughtering 500 human beings would look like, and think about what kind of people can do that kind of an atrocity. Certainly not exclusive or unique to Russia, nor is it exclusive, unique to countries in Africa. We have monsters all over this world. But what I'm trying to do is to get people to have a more, I guess you could say, a more kind of visceral understanding, a more palpable kind of image of what it is that Russia's actually doing in a place like Mali, or in a place like Sudan, or even in a place like Libya, where they also were accused of massacres, or in Mozambique, where they were accused of massacres, or in Burkina Faso, where they're accused of massacres, right? So this UN report is very thorough. I can understand why it took so long. And this undermines a lot of the narrative that Russia represents some kind of an alternative. The only real service, quote unquote, that Russia's providing in Mali is running security for the military junta. That's really what it's all about. They are essentially bodyguards in, paramilitary uniform. They are essentially bodyguards for this illegitimate government. Now, I say it's an illegitimate government, it's a military junta, but I'm not suggesting that I disagree with ejecting the French. Of course, the French are neo-colonial monsters themselves. They've spent several centuries exploiting West Africa, exploiting all of these areas, stealing their wealth, forcing them into a dependent colonial and neo-colonial relationship. But at the same time, it's important that we understand that Russia is no alternative. These are Nazi murderers running around in Mali. And now, at least finally, we have the definitive evidence from the UN report. This was reported a long time ago. There was information and intelligence on this the minute it happened. Okay. And that reminds me of the shithead that I used to know and used to think had some political understanding, who comes from Mali and who justifies these actions, saying, "Oh well, yeah, you're just anti-Russian and you don't understand what's going on." Okay, fair. I don't live in Mali. I read about it, but I don't live there. So tell me what's going on. Ah, that village was a Daesh village. That village was terrorists. Sure, of course, the 5-year-old child was a terrorist. The teen girl who was raped repeatedly and then got a bullet in her head, definitely, absolutely a terrorist, right? This is the thinking, the internalization of war on terror, neocon ideology that is then, in the most sickening way, uh, transformed into an allegedly anti-imperialist kind of position, wherein a Nazi death squad, which is essentially what Wagner is, a Nazi death squad represents hope, progress. Why? Because they're killing the terrorists. You have the same logic in Syria. Russian military wantonly, just absolutely just carpet bombing, essentially massacring from the air, day after day, week after week, month after month, bombing hospitals, bombing residential buildings, etc. And Assad's forces, of course, doing the bulk of that too. But I mean to say that this is part of the reality of how the Russians operate. This is what it is. This is how they do it. So I think that, we have to kind of keep in the back of our mind that, not everybody not everybody who presents themselves as having a left-wing viewpoint is really on the left. In fact, many of them are crypto fascists. Many of them cheer on the Russians, cheer on Wagner, hope they get Bakhmut, hope they destroy the Nazi regime in Kiev and all of this other nonsense, right? This is the kind of brain rot that has to be opposed on the left. And that's what I'm doing. All right, 30 minutes. I got to leave it there. There's a bunch of other stories, but we're out of time. I'll do another one very soon. Thank you all for the continued support. Oh, I guess I should plug my stuff. If you're seeing this on YouTube, go over to Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. If you're seeing this on Patreon, well, then you're already there. Talk to you guys next time.